Voiceover begins. Have you ever wondered what secrets a millionaire CEO hides in his office? The millionaire CEO walked into his office expecting another routine morning, until he found two 6-year-old boys asleep on the floor, and everything he thought he knew about his life unraveled in an instant. Lucas Bennett arrived at his office at exactly 6:45 a.m., as he did every morning without fail. The rest of the building was still dark and still, the kind of silence that only came before the city woke up. The cleaning crew had already left, and the first employees wouldn't arrive for another hour. Lucas liked it that way, orderly, uninterrupted, predictable. He moved through the main hallway without looking up, swiping his access card with practiced motion, his leather shoes making soft clicks on the marble floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee from the automated machine near reception followed him faintly. Though he didn't stop for a cup today. He had a meeting to prepare for, a conference call to review, and a press release that still needed his final approval. Everything was scheduled. Everything was under control. But the moment he stepped into his personal office, something felt wrong. The air was warmer than usual, slightly lived in. There was a blanket folded neatly on the leather couch that hadn't been there the night before. A half-empty bottle of water sat on the side table. He frowned, stepping further into the room, scanning every detail automatically. Then he heard it, soft breathing, slow and steady, coming from the corner behind his desk. He froze for half a second, every muscle alert. Someone was here. Cautiously, Lucas walked around the edge of his desk and stopped cold. Curled up on the plush carpet were two small boys, sound asleep, tangled together like puppies, their heads resting against each other. One clutched a stuffed bear that looked like it had been through more than one childhood. They couldn't have been more than 6. Their clothes were rumpled, pajamas that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. Their faces were smudged, their shoes placed neatly beside them like they tried to be polite about their intrusion. Lucas didn't speak at first. He just stared at them, trying to understand what he was seeing. Slowly, carefully, he knelt beside them and gently touched the shoulder of the boy closest to him. The child stirred, his eyes fluttering open, wide, and startlingly blue. The other boy blinked next, sitting up groggy. Both boys looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion. "Are you going to call the police?" the first one asked, his voice small but steady. Lucas shook his head slightly, still too stunned to form a full sentence. "No," he finally managed. "But you have to tell me, what are you doing here?" The boys exchanged a glance, silent words passing between them. Then the one holding the bear said, "We didn't mean to break anything. We just wanted somewhere warm to sleep." Lucas felt something shift in his chest. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The other boy swallowed hard. "Our mom, she died last week." The words fell like a stone in the quiet room. Lucas exhaled slowly, staring at the two boys sitting on his office floor, suddenly no longer strangers. He studied their faces. Those identical deep blue eyes, and a wave of unease washed over him, not fear, but familiarity. He knew those eyes. He had seen them before, just not in children. The taller one added, "Our mom used to work here. She told us this place was safe. She said if something ever happened to her, and we didn't know where to go, we should come here." Lucas's breath caught in his throat. "What was her name?" he asked, even though part of him already knew. "Sarah Hope," the boy said quietly. And that was it. That name, a name he hadn't heard in years, hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah, his former employee, the woman he remembered as quiet, capable, kind. She'd left the company suddenly. No warning, no farewell. He'd barely thought of her since. And now her children were sitting on his floor, lost and alone. Lucas stood, mind reeling, trying to process what was happening. He called his assistant and told her to cancel his meetings. Then he sat back down on the floor beside them, loosening his tie, feeling like the air had changed around him. "You're safe here," he said softly, not just to reassure them, but because he meant it. He just didn't know yet what that would come to mean. What if these boys hold the key to a hidden past? Lucas didn't leave the office that morning. He sat on the floor with the boys until the sun had fully risen and the sound of employees arriving echoed through the marble halls outside, but no one disturbed them. His assistant had followed his unusual instructions to reroute all appointments and keep the door closed. The boys, Ben and Jamie, as they finally introduced themselves, were quiet at first, speaking only when asked and always looking to each other before answering as if making sure they were allowed. Lucas noticed how they mirrored each other's body language, how they stayed close, how they watched him with both curiosity and caution. They reminded him of street cats, skittish, alert, waiting to run if anything changed too quickly. He brought them breakfast from the executive kitchen upstairs, toast, scrambled eggs, orange juice, and watched as they devoured it like they hadn't eaten properly in days. When he asked how long they'd been on their own, Ben, the slightly more outspoken of the two, shrugged and said, "Since Mama went to the hospital, then she didn't come back." Jamie added softly, "The man who came for us said we'd have to go with strangers, so we left before they came back." Lucas felt a cold knot twist in his stomach. These boys had run from the system, from being processed into some cold, bureaucratic path their mother hadn't chosen for them. They had no one, except now they had found their way to him. He called a private pediatrician to check them over. The doctor, an older man who had treated executive families discreetly for years, arrived quickly and examined the boys in Lucas's private lounge. They were healthy, if slightly underweight and clearly underfed. No visible injuries. The doctor gave them vitamins and assured Lucas they were okay for now, but cautioned that trauma often lived deeper than what a stethoscope could hear. Lucas thanked him and asked him to come back in a week. Later that day, Lucas stood alone in his office, watching the boys nap on the couch with his own company's branded blankets draped over them. He thought about Sarah. He remembered how she always kept to herself, never asked for favors, never missed a deadline. She had worked in client services, handling angry customers with a calm voice and unfailing patience. He had spoken to her only a handful of times. But once he remembered, he had walked past the break room and seen her laughing with a coworker, head thrown back, something warm in her expression. That image came back now like a memory resurfacing from deep water. He wondered how she had ended up so alone, how she had become a mother without him ever knowing, and why, of all places, she had told her sons to come to his building. He searched her name in the company archive. There it was, Sarah Hope. Hired 7 years ago, left without explanation 3 years later. No emergency contact listed. He dug deeper, bypassing HR firewalls with his own credentials until he found a file that made him stop cold. A scanned document never delivered, labeled personal, confidential. It was a letter to him, written in Sarah's handwriting. He printed it and sat down to read it slowly, every line sinking into his chest. In the letter, Sarah explained everything. She wrote about their brief connection, just one night after the company's annual gala. She hadn't meant for anything to happen, but it had. When she found out she was pregnant, she debated telling him, but she'd watched the way he chased success, how focused he was, how carefully he guarded his time. She didn't want to become someone else needing something from him. So, she left. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness or even understanding. She just wanted him to know if anything ever happened to her. She had told the boys to go where they'd be safe, to him. Lucas folded the letter and stared out the window for a long time. There was no storm, no explosion, just a deep stillness inside him, like a door opening. It had all been there all along, his children, his chance to be more than the man who closed deals and sat in corner offices. He turned back toward the couch where Ben had turned in his sleep and now clutched the stuffed bear tighter. Jamie stirred next to him, curling closer. Lucas stood, walked over, and knelt beside them. He didn't wake them. He just placed his hand gently on the edge of the couch and whispered so softly it was almost a promise to himself, "I'm not going anywhere." He meant it more than anything he'd ever said in a boardroom, because this wasn't business. This was the beginning of something real. Can a billionaire's heart truly change for two lost souls? The next morning, Lucas arrived at the office later than usual. It was the first time in over a decade that someone else had started his day without him. He didn't feel anxious about it. For once, his mind wasn't filled with revenue charts or market projections. Instead, it was focused on making sure Ben and Jamie had clean clothes, warm food, and a safe place to sleep. He had arranged for a suite in a private residential wing owned by the company, a place usually reserved for visiting executives or board members, but now freshly cleaned and prepared for two small boys who had never stepped foot in a hotel room. When Lucas picked them up from temporary care the night before, they hadn't spoken much in the car, but they had both clutched his hands tightly when he walked them through the doors. That morning, Lucas sat with Maggie Holt, the assigned social worker, in a quiet office at Child Services. She was direct, her tone professional, but not unkind. She had seen too many promises broken, too many children shuffled like numbers. "You understand this isn't a temporary solution," she said. "Foster care is the legal route, and we're not in the habit of handing children over to anyone without due process, even a biological father." Lucas looked her in the eye and said calmly but with conviction, "I'm not looking for a shortcut. I want to do this right." She nodded once and told him the process: court paperwork, DNA verification, psychological evaluations, home visits. It could take weeks, months even. Lucas accepted every step without protest. If this was what it took, he would wait. Later that day, while the boys were napping back at the suite, Lucas sat in his office reading through a folder of paperwork Maggie had given him. One form in particular caught his eye: intent to adopt. He wasn't just being asked to provide care. He was being asked if he wanted to claim them completely. The idea struck him not with fear, but with a strange, powerful warmth. Until recently, his legacy had always been numbers, valuations, stock prices, media articles with his name bolded. But now, he realized that a legacy wasn't what you built for the world. It was what you left in the hearts of those closest to you. He didn't hesitate. He signed it. That evening, he returned to the suite and found the boys building something with pillows and chairs. It looked like a spaceship or maybe a tent. They jumped when they saw him, but then quickly relaxed. Ben ran up and said, "We saved you the captain's chair," while Jamie handed him a paper plate with imaginary food scribbled on it and marker. Lucas sat on the floor with them for over an hour, letting them pull him into their strange, wonderful universe of pretend. He laughed more than he had in years. At one point, Jamie looked up at him and asked, "Are we going to stay here forever?" Lucas paused, met his eyes, and said, "You're going to stay with me?" "That's a promise." Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Lucas stood at the edge of the room watching them. Their breathing was even, their faces peaceful. He thought about Sarah again. What kind of strength it must have taken for her to raise them alone, to protect them, to keep them from reaching out to a man she must have resented, and yet still believed would one day do the right thing. He wondered how often she had thought about writing him again, how close she had come to calling. It filled him with both sorrow and gratitude. She had believed in him, even from a distance. Now it was his turn to be worthy of that belief. He stayed there until his legs ached, watching the steady rise and fall of their chests, the slight twitch of a dream passing behind Jamie's eyelids. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the layers of strategy, silence, and structure, something irreversible clicked into place. This was not a rescue mission. This was not redemption. This was simply a father found too late, standing still so he would never lose his sons again. The days that followed moved slowly but meaningfully, as if time had deliberately slowed down to give Lucas a chance to catch up with the life he had missed. Every morning began with a quiet routine. He would wake the boys gently, learning how each preferred to start the day. Jamie needed a few minutes of silence before he was ready to talk, while Ben would immediately start asking questions, most of them strange, childlike wonders that had no answers. Lucas never rushed them. He helped them dress, made breakfast with varying levels of success, and packed their backpacks for the temporary day program Maggie had arranged while the custody case moved forward. It was the most purposeful his days had ever felt, and yet there was a fragility to it all, a sense that one wrong move might shatter everything. Back at work, Lucas found it nearly impossible to slip back into his former state of mind. Conference calls felt hollow. Boardroom presentations more like performances than decisions. For the first time in his career, he began handing off responsibilities to people he had once hesitated to trust. He left meetings early to pick the boys up, canceled dinner with investors to attend a school orientation, and chose a toy store over a wine bar on more than one occasion. His assistant, initially bewildered by the sudden shift in priorities, had quietly started leaving sticky notes with reminders like, Ben's parent form due and Jamie needs new sneakers on his desk alongside financial reports. The boys, still wary at times, were slowly beginning to settle into the unfamiliar world of stability. Jamie, the more sensitive of the two, had started drawing pictures of our house, even though they still lived in the company's residential suite. Ben had taken to calling Lucas Dad in private moments, as if testing how it felt in his mouth. Lucas never corrected them. He didn't rush them. But every time the word slipped out, he felt something loosen inside him, something heavy and long buried. They had gone from calling him Mr. Lucas to whispering, "Dad," when no one was listening. He didn't need it to be loud to believe it. One evening, Maggie stopped by to conduct a home visit, checking the boys' environment and observing their interactions. She arrived with a clipboard, but as she stepped into the suite and saw the chaos, blankets draped over chairs forming a makeshift fort, puzzles half done on the coffee table, dinner dishes in the sink, and two boys happily bickering over what to watch on TV, her expression softened. Lucas offered her tea, and they sat while the boys played in the next room. Maggie said quietly, "I've worked in this field for over 10 years. Most of the time I walk into situations where kids are just surviving. This is the first time in a long time I've walked into a place where I see kids actually beginning to live." Lucas didn't answer right away. He was still learning how to accept words like that, how to allow himself to believe he might be doing something right. Eventually, he nodded and said, "They changed everything. I didn't even know what I was missing until they showed up on my office floor asleep." Maggie gave him a rare smile, not just of approval, but of understanding. After she left, Lucas joined the boys in their fort. They had saved him a spot, and Ben had even made a name plate out of cardboard that said, "Dad's Space." He climbed inside, awkward in his expensive clothes. But the moment he sat down, Jamie leaned against his side and closed his eyes. It was such a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. Lucas stayed there for over an hour, listening to them tell stories and argue about whether clouds could fall out of the sky. They didn't notice when he stopped talking. Didn't realize that behind his quiet presence was a man silently overwhelmed by what he'd found. That night, as he tucked them in, Jamie looked up and said, "Do we have to leave again soon?" Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, brushed hair back from Jamie's forehead, and said softly, "No, this is your home now. You're staying. I'm not going anywhere." Jamie nodded like he wanted to believe it, but didn't know how. Lucas didn't push. He just stayed in the room long after they had fallen asleep. The glow from the hallway casting soft light on their faces. He had lived in a world where permanence was a myth, where loyalty was conditional, where every relationship was transactional. But now, with each passing day, he was learning what it meant to belong to someone, not through ownership or obligation, but through presence and love. And he wasn't going to let that go. A few weeks had passed since Lucas found the boys in his office, and although the days now moved with a certain rhythm, the emotional terrain remained unfamiliar. Every morning began with simple routines. Pajamas exchanged for clothes that actually fit. Cereal that spilled more often than it stayed in bowls. Mismatched socks that neither boy seemed to mind. Lucas was learning to navigate the chaos not with control, but with quiet participation. He had stopped trying to perfect every moment and instead began showing up fully inside of them. There were still questions from the boys, though fewer now. They had stopped asking if they were going to be taken away and instead started asking things like what time dinner would be or whether Lucas could come to their class presentation. Their fears hadn't vanished entirely, but they had begun to feel safe enough to dream ahead by a few hours or even a full day. One Wednesday afternoon, Lucas got a call from the boys' teacher asking if he could stop by school to speak briefly about Jamie. Apparently, Jamie had withdrawn in class that morning, refused to participate in group work, and had hidden in a corner during recess. Lucas drove straight from the office, arriving in slacks and a half-loosened tie, and sat across from the teacher in the small meeting room with laminated posters on the wall and plastic chairs that made everything feel a bit too small for what was being discussed. The teacher didn't speak with concern as much as with gentle awareness. She explained that trauma often didn't express itself loudly. Sometimes it appeared in silence, in moments where a child chose to disappear before anyone could make them feel unwanted. Afterwards, Lucas found Jamie in the library, curled up with a picture book he wasn't really reading. He sat beside him on the carpeted floor and waited until Jamie looked up. His eyes were red, not from tears exactly, but from holding too many of them back. Lucas didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, he said, "You know, when I was your age, I used to hide under my bed when I got overwhelmed. Everyone thought I was brave, but really, I just didn't want anyone to see me scared." Jamie looked at him for a long moment and then leaned sideways, resting his small shoulder against Lucas's arm. It wasn't a hug, not really, but it was something even more honest. Lucas wrapped his arm around him, careful and slow, and said nothing more. That night, after the boys were asleep, Lucas sat on the balcony of the suite with a cup of tea he didn't drink, staring out over the lights of the city. For years, those lights had represented victory, speed, progress. Now they looked different, distant, smaller. He thought about how easy it had been to believe that being a good man meant being efficient, successful, respected. He had confused control with purpose, authority with strength. But parenting, if he could even call what he was doing that, wasn't about control. It was about witnessing, about staying when things got quiet or confusing or painful, about sitting beside a child on a school library floor and being a place to lean. He thought about Sarah more often now, what she must have carried alone, what she must have feared would happen if she reached out, and what incredible trust it had taken to tell her sons in her final days to seek shelter with the one person she wasn't sure would care. That trust had become the foundation on which Lucas now stood. It felt both like an honor and a debt he could never repay. Maggie stopped by again the next day with updated paperwork. Things were moving faster now. The paternity results had finalized everything, and the courts, moved by the consistency of Lucas's involvement, were preparing for a formal custody hearing. Lucas reviewed the files without hesitation. When Maggie asked if he wanted legal guardianship or full adoption, he answered before she could finish the question. "Adoption," he said. "They're mine. I want them to know that for the rest of their lives." Later that week, while helping Jamie with a math worksheet and watching Ben try to tape together a paper robot, Lucas realized that he no longer felt like an imposter in his own life. He had become a man he barely recognized, and he liked who he was becoming. He had known the weight of failure before, but this was the first time he had felt the weight of being counted on, not for profit or performance, but for presence. He had built an empire out of concrete and glass. But this messy, beautiful, uncertain new life was the first time he had ever built a home. Spring arrived with a quiet ease, bringing longer days and soft sunlight that spilled across the hardwood floors of the suite each morning, waking the boys before their alarms. Lucas had settled into the new life with a strange sense of grace. He was still running a company, still signing off on deals and attending strategic meetings, but everything felt different now. His calendar, once guarded like a fortress, now bent around school pickups, therapy appointments, bedtime routines, and weekend visits to the park. He had learned how to make waffles without burning them, how to braid string for school art projects, and how to quietly sit beside Jamie when the boy needed to cry but didn't want to talk. These small things were never on any of Lucas's old agendas. But now they filled more space in his heart than entire mergers ever had. There were moments when the boys tested him. Jamie had started having nightmares again, waking in the middle of the night, crying for a mother he couldn't fully remember. Ben had become moody at school, lashing out at a classmate who joked about people without parents. Lucas didn't have perfect answers, but he listened. He showed up. He called the boys' therapist for advice and sat through every session when allowed. He made sure they knew they didn't have to be okay all the time. The emotional work was harder than anything he had faced as a CEO because it wasn't about strategy. It was about honesty and patience. And yet, for the first time, he felt he was building something that actually mattered. One Sunday afternoon, the boys were in the living room building an elaborate Lego city on the rug. Lucas watched them from the kitchen, washing dishes slowly as he listened to them argue about whether the tower should have 3 or 4 stories. The laughter, the shouting, the scattered plastic bricks, it all made the once sterile space feel like a home. Sarah's absence lived in that room, too. Quiet but undeniable. Sometimes Lucas would catch a glimpse of her in the boys' mannerisms. How Jamie tilted his head when he was confused, how Ben raised one eyebrow when he didn't believe something. He thought of Sarah often now, not with regret, but with deep respect. She had done so much alone, and somehow had raised 2 boys with kindness still intact in them. He hoped she knew they were safe now. He hoped she would be proud of what he was trying to become. That evening, after the boys had gone to sleep and the apartment was quiet again, Lucas sat with a notebook in his lap and wrote a letter to Sarah. He didn't know what made him do it, only that something inside him needed to be said, even if no one would ever read it. He wrote about the boys, the way Jamie hummed when he was focused, the way Ben insisted on kissing his hand every night before bed and calling it the official seal. He told her how scared he had been, how much he had failed at first, and how desperately he wanted to get it right now. He ended the letter with a promise. I will love them with everything I have. Not because I'm trying to make up for the past, but because I finally understand what love is. The next morning, Lucas woke up to find the boys had made him breakfast. Toast with jam, poured orange juice, and a note that read, "To the best dad from your boys." The toast was cold. The juice was too warm. But Lucas sat down at the table like it was the finest meal of his life. Jamie climbed into his lap, unbothered by his rumpled tie, and Ben asked if they could go to the zoo that weekend. Lucas said yes to both without thinking. Later that day, as they walked to school, Jamie slipped his hand into Lucas's and asked quietly, "Are we really yours now?" "For real?" Lucas stopped walking, knelt down in front of him, and looked into his wide, uncertain eyes. "You were mine the moment I found you," he said. "Now the whole world knows it, too." Jamie smiled, not big or bright, but in the kind of way that showed it mattered. He squeezed Lucas's hand once, then ran ahead to catch up with Ben, who was already halfway down the block. Lucas stood there for a moment, letting the morning sun warm his face, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and children's laughter. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the one that had waited quietly for him to be ready. And now, finally, he was. Lucas had always believed that transformation came in bold gestures or sweeping moments. The launch of a product, the signing of a multi-million-dollar contract, the rise of a stock price. But now he was learning that the most powerful changes often happen slowly, quietly, in the repetition of simple acts. Week after week, the rhythm of life with Ben and Jamie deepened until the presence of the boys was no longer something he was adjusting to. It was just life. They had their own mugs now with little dinosaurs on them and a row of shoes by the door that never stayed neatly aligned. Lucas learned which nightlight Jamie liked and how Ben always needed a story with at least one dragon. Their lives had fused in ways that could no longer be untangled. What Lucas hadn't expected was how the rest of his world would shift to match it. His colleagues at the company had started to see a different side of him, and instead of resistance, many responded with something like admiration. He had become more patient, more present, less explosive in meetings, and somehow even more effective. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was managing from above. He felt like he was leading from inside. His assistant, Emily, had taken to reminding him of school events and spelling bee dates as naturally as she once reminded him of investor briefings. Everyone seemed to understand that the man who once lived for control had now built his life around care. One Thursday afternoon, as he walked into the boys' school for a parent conference, Lucas was greeted with a wave from Jamie across the hallway. The boy's smile was radiant, wide, and full of confidence, and it struck Lucas how far they had come since that first morning in his office. The meeting went smoothly. The teacher praised Ben's creativity and noted how Jamie had begun opening up more during group activities. Lucas sat in the two small chairs with a ridiculous sense of pride, absorbing every word like it was a report on the most important project of his life. When he returned home that evening, the boys were waiting with a surprise, a cake they had tried to bake with the help of a babysitter, complete with messy icing and a crooked candle in the middle. "Because we're a real family now," Ben announced. Lucas almost laughed at the formality of it, but found himself swallowing a wave of emotion instead. He let them sing to him, even if the lyrics were made up halfway through, and blew out the candle with a quiet wish he didn't speak out loud. It didn't matter. He already had everything he would have wished for. That weekend, Lucas drove the boys to the cemetery. It was something he had been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't known how to approach. He didn't tell them much on the way, just that it was a place they should see, someone they should meet. He brought flowers, nothing fancy, just soft white lilies, and led them to the grave he had visited only once before when he first confirmed the truth of who they were. Sarah's name was carved into the stone, elegant and simple. Jamie reached for Lucas's hand as they stood there, and Ben knelt to place the flowers carefully at the base. Lucas didn't know what to say at first. The boys were quiet, watching him. "She was strong," Lucas finally said, his voice low and steady. "She loved you more than anything in the world, and she made sure you would find your way even when she couldn't be with you anymore." Ben nodded slowly, and Jamie pressed his face into Lucas's arm. They stayed for a while, not speaking, letting the silence carry the meaning none of them could articulate. On the drive home, the boys were unusually quiet, but it wasn't a heavy silence. It was thoughtful. Lucas glanced at them in the rearview mirror and saw something in their faces that felt like peace. That night, as he tucked them into bed, Jamie looked up and asked, "Do you think she sees us?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "I know she does, and she's proud of you." "Of us," Ben added. "She's probably laughing at your pancakes." Lucas grinned. "She probably is." After they fell asleep, Lucas sat alone in the living room, the hum of the city muffled by thick windows. He thought about how far they had come, about the countless steps that had led from that cold, quiet office floor to this loud, imperfect home. He had become someone he didn't recognize, but only because he had finally become the person he was always meant to be. And somehow, in the loss and the discovery, in the grief and the joy, he had found a life that didn't need to be earned or conquered. It only needed to be lived. Summer arrived gently, stretching daylight into long, golden evenings that filled the city with warmth and energy. For the first time in his adult life, Lucas didn't measure his days by revenue targets or quarterly closings. He measured them in the sound of laughter from the living room, in the quiet weight of a sleeping child resting against his chest during movie night, in the sticky fingers from melting popsicles eaten too fast on the balcony. The suite that had once been temporary was now fully lived in, every corner shaped by the presence of Ben and Jamie. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, a soccer ball that somehow always rolled into the hallway, and stacks of books on every surface, half-read and well-loved. The adoption papers were finalized in early June. The hearing was short, almost anticlimactic, but when the judge looked over his glasses and said, "Effective today, Lucas Bennett is the legal father of Benjamin and James Hope," something shifted in the air. Ben reached for his hand immediately. Jamie turned to look at him with the wide, cautious eyes that had been with him from the beginning and then whispered, "We're really yours now, aren't we?" Lucas didn't say yes. He just hugged them both, arms wrapped tightly around their small bodies, and nodded because that moment didn't need words. The truth had already been living between them. They celebrated that night with pizza, balloons, and an uneven homemade cake that the boys insisted on decorating themselves. The apartment was filled with music and dancing and the sort of chaos that once would have made Lucas tense, but now filled him with a steady joy he didn't know he had room for. At one point, Ben jumped onto the couch, held up a plastic spoon like a microphone, and shouted, "This is for our dad, the best one ever." Jamie, not to be outdone, added, "Even if he burns pancakes every Sunday." Lucas laughed so hard he had to sit down. Over the next few weeks, life settled into something that felt like rhythm. Not every day was perfect. There were still tantrums, sleepless nights, and moments where Lucas questioned if he was doing anything right. But those doubts didn't linger like they once had. They didn't define him anymore. The boys didn't expect perfection. They expected presence, and Lucas gave it without hesitation. One morning, Lucas took them to the beach. It was a small stretch of sand just outside the city. Quiet on weekdays and clean enough to feel like a true escape. They spent hours building sand castles, chasing waves, and eating sandwiches that got too much sand in them to be appetizing, though neither boy cared. At one point, Lucas stood waist deep in the ocean, watching Ben teach Jamie how to float. Their laughter rose above the crashing waves, bright and free. Lucas realized, standing there with salt in his hair and sun on his face, that this was the moment Sarah had trusted him to find. Not just safety, not just survival, but life. Unfiltered, unguarded, full of joy. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep with sunburned noses and damp hair, Lucas sat on the balcony with a photo of Sarah. It was one he had found buried in the company archives, a staff photo from years ago. Sarah smiling quietly at the edge of a group, her eyes soft but strong. He looked at her face and spoke out loud, not because he expected anyone to hear, but because it felt right. "They're okay," he said. "I hope you see them. I hope you know I'll never let them go." He stayed out there until the city dimmed and the stars began to peek through the haze. When he went back inside, he paused in the hallway, looking into the boys' room. Jamie had one arm flung off the side of the bed, and Ben had somehow managed to kick off all his blankets again. Lucas adjusted the covers, kissed both their foreheads, and whispered goodnight. This was his life now, not a detour, not a project, a family. And every moment of it, even the hard ones, were worth more than everything he'd spent his life chasing. He hadn't just gained 2 sons. He had found his place in the world, finally, completely, and without question. Outro: Millionaire in Love. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories.